stronger than that for food. And let me now take you through pages of history with some excellent speakers joining us on stage. And talking on history, a question of interpretation. For the session, we have with us Mr. Anirban Ganguly and historians Samuel Berthit and Vikram Sampath. May I now request Mr. Ganguly, Mr. Berthit and Mr. Sampath to please join us on stage. Over to the chairman.
Prabeen ji has kind of set the tone for how the session must go. So I'll basically follow that. Not speak much, but encourage a discussion and a conversation. So this session's theme is History, a question of interpretation. Je suis vraiment très heureux, enchanté de vous voir ici et c'est un honneur d'être, de pouvoir dire quelque chose sur l'histoire de l'Inde en votre présence.
Merci. Thank you, Anirban. Thank you very much.
So, so I just said that I'm enchanted and honored to be in his presence and to be able to say a few things on history in his company. So it's very interesting and ironical also that in the last session I was there as in the biography session a non-biographer, and again in a history session a non-historian. So in any case I'll try my best. History has always been a very debated and contested topic in India, and like perhaps in any other country. And for example, in France, you've had some of the major and some of the most influential schools of history which have sprung up. And one of those who have really inspired me most has been Fernand Braudel himself. The vast sweep of history, the longue durée of history. In the Indian context, it has been a very interesting journey. Now, if one were to read Dipesh Chakravarti's latest book on Jadunath Sarkar, a near-forgotten historian, Sir Jadunath Sarkar and the Empire of His Truth, he was a historian who did most in interpreting and deconstructing Mughal history. Jadunath Sarkar, after a point of time, was nearly forgotten. And this biography basically revives him. But why is it important for me as a reader? I find it fascinating because it analyzes the way Sir Jadunath Sarkar approached history, the way he interpreted. And he was one of those who, again, read primary texts in the original. He read Persian texts, translated them for his own books. And that's something which is fascinating, and a number of historians over the years have also lost that quality. But what attracts people like us in that book is that there was a whole period in Indian historiographical evolution when you needn't have to be a professional historian in order to write history. You could yourself be a scholar in quest and produce historical writing. I believe that over the years got lost because there was this group or this school of historians who emerged and who said, look, we are qualified professional historians. We have the right to write on history. You are not a historian, so desist. I think a lot of flavor was lost. A lot of interesting dimensions that could have come got lost. So history and interpretation has many potentials. For example, I was discussing with Samuel just before the session and even yesterday. You have this entire archival material which is there, which is not published, perceptions of India by Scots and French explorers, painters, civil servants, soldiers during the 17th and 18th century. And I had started working on it, produced also a monograph where it broke my impression, and I came to realize that you can't lump all Western analysis of India into one category, because even in that there were variations. So you can distinctly see the British approach to India, and you can see a distinction between the French and the Scots. And the way they looked was empathetic and was based on primary observations of the land, of the people, of society. You had, for example, Alexander Walker, a forgotten figure, Colonel Alexander Walker of the East India Company, who has this about 100 plus diaries of his on India, which is kept at the Scottish National Archives. And James Mill would correspond with Alexander Walker when he started writing his history of British India. And you realize the vast difference in perception. James Mill, who never came to India, wrote the British history of British India, and Alexander Walker, who actually served for 40 years in India, and he talks extremely highly, without eulogizing or glorifying, of Indian society, even at that period, is a forgotten figure today. So, I'll not get into, because one can keep talking about it. I have two eminent speakers and discussants and panelists here who have actually worked on these issues, and then we'll get into the conversation as it is. So I would like, Samuel, you would like to make your, yes.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction and those French words. When we start dealing with the matter of history, it is very vast, and of course we deal with memory, we deal with perceptions, we deal with critical analysis of documents. And Arnab was doing a very relevant point if we take the question of the history of India and the sources on which the history have been, different studies in history have been produced. There is a whole process, of course, of selection. That's how the memory functions. That's also how the history is processed. And since you were mentioning the first-hand material, the sources on Indian history, it is true that we have a huge gamut of material when it comes to India of the 17th, 18th century, which has not really reached the readers for different reasons. And I think it's the main point in studying history, it's really to challenge our perceptions, which history is very often written in a very linear manner with that kind of Enlightenment perspective of the 18th century with the idea of a linear progress. And if you read, for instance, the French travelers who came to India in the 17th, 18th century, of course, it's heavily contextualized according to the regions where they traveled, but often it is depicted as a land of which really deserves attention. We forget that there's been a huge transfer of technology happening during 17th and 18th century from the Indian Ocean to Europe. And then one gets a totally non-linear perception of history, which of course, is there embedded in the Western mind and Western philosophy, that idea of a continuous progress. And of course, things are much more complicated than that. 18th century India, to take that example, or South Asia, whatever we call it, was definitively looked at as a land of wealth, as a land of hygiene, for instance. And it was actually even very difficult for many of the European East Indian companies to keep their European employees, because they would very often shift towards Indian rulers, and where they would get somehow a better, better work conditions, and most of them would actually live the Indian way of life. There's a long history, of course, connecting Europe and the Indian Ocean. We forget that during the Roman Empire also the flow of goods and ideas was really much more from the Indian Ocean towards the Mediterranean Sea, and not the other way around. It's of course already the textile were highly regarded. The Roman, the dress of the Roman aristocracy was actually heavily influenced by the textile coming from India. And when I teach history to my students, I do teach them about that idea of flow, of circulations, of ever-changing things, and certainly questioning their perceptions about society in general, and often the way the medias or the way the mainstream thoughts look at the world we live in seems to be kind of extremely unidimensional. And when you start studying history, you have to deal with different languages, different point of views, and then you start looking at the world you live in a very different manner. Bikram, I'm sure you have more to say.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Ganguly, before I get to details on the subject, I'd probably also mention here that I perhaps belong to the category you described right at the beginning. I was not, when I got into the art and craft of writing history, not an academically trained historian, and thank God for that, because the way history is taught in our schools and colleges, unfortunately, doesn't lend it to be a subject, which is very sad, doesn't lend it to be a subject which reaches out to a large audience, and which also inspires and excites young readers. So I'd like to probably begin with my entry into this whole subject of history. As a student in class 6 or 7, a boy of 12 or 13 that I was then, there was this, I'm sure many of you in the audience know about the serial, The Sword of Tipu Sultan, which was being telecast on Doordarshan. Tipu Sultan, even as we talk today, the top 5 trends on Twitter today is ban Tipu Jayanti, which is being celebrated by the Congress government in Karnataka. Now, these are issues which never get resolved for decades and centuries. So there was this serial where there were competing contestants in medieval history of Mysore, the state I come from, Karnataka. So you had the Wadiyar dynasty, the Hindu rulers, one of India's longest reigning royal houses, who were there for 600 long years, and a period of 40 years of interregnum when Hyder Ali and his son Tipu took over or usurped the kingdom from them. So naturally the Hindu-Muslim conflict would get into such a troubled area. And in this particular serial, you had those of you who remember the serial would know that the Maharaja of Mysore was shown like this obese retard who was dancing along with the court dancer. The Maharani was shown as one of those typical vamps from these Ekta Kapoor serials, always conspiring and conniving and trying to overthrow Tipu. And this led to, like always, we are very sensitive people, we get offended very easily. So there were protests in different parts of Karnataka about this. And as a young boy, who I must confess here, who hated history as a subject, because all it meant was memorizing dates and who succeeded whom and which war was fought in which era and so on, which actually, again, I point out to the way history is taught in our schools. Every history class almost for me meant kneeling down outside, because I really didn't get these facts in my head. And my history teacher of school would probably have a mild cardiac arrest if she knows that I'm on a panel on history today here. So for someone like that who didn't like history in school, and I was seeing these protests and also this serial very closely, I don't know what turned inside me that I decided almost on a completely self-motivated and more importantly self-funded initiative to find out the truth behind the falsehood. You described about this whole urge for quest. I think that a historian is almost like an investigative journalist who gets into a tunnel without knowing whether there's light at the end of it or the light is of the train coming from the other side. So one really doesn't know. And in the path, in the course of that journey, one leads to another. And I must mention that my passion for the Mysore history lasted for almost 10 years while I was doing my engineering and my other things. And now, of course, I have a PhD in history to accredit academically. But then that was my journey. And then the interest graduated from that one king and queen who were misrepresented to the entire dynasty of the Wadiyars. And here we must also mention, and I think state the fact that the way Indian history is represented itself is very skewed. You have large, regions of India which go unrepresented in our textbooks. I'm sure as a student in Bangalore, I don't think in my school textbooks I read anything about Odisha's history. At the same time, the Northeast, how many of us know about the Ahom dynasty? The South Indian kingdoms matter almost nothing other than cursory references to the Cholas and the Pallavas and other dynasties. So we have a very strict narrative which has come down the ages, dominated with, of course, a lot of the North Indian kingdoms, the Muslim dynasties, and of course the Marathas and so on, who dominate our history. So with that in mind, when after 10 years of research, I had realized that the Mysore kingdom was one of the most progressive kingdoms of that time, at independence. In fact, Gandhiji had wondered whether a kingdom which was as progressive as Mysore even needed freedom, because the first province in India to have a representative system of government, the first province in India to give education to women, to minorities, the first province to give franchise to women, which was unknown in the rest of India, to have reservations for scheduled castes and tribes in government jobs. And when the Krishnaraja Sagar Dam was built, in Mysore, it was the largest in Asia and second largest in the world. So there were numerous such credits, and I found it very disconcerting that popular Indian historical narrative did not put these aspects or underscore these aspects. And that is how, I wrote my first book, which was The Splendors of Royal Mysore, the untold story of the Wadiyars. It was untold because nobody had really bothered to tell it. And 600 years is a long period of time in a state's history. And to keep that away from the larger readership of the country, I thought was travesty with truth. And so that was my journey into history, and I'll take on more as we move along.
It's very interesting. Vikram, you make these points, and Samuel also. Speaking of the Maharaja Wadiyars of Mysore, it's very interesting that, you see, what has happened is there's this huge gap in our historiography where we have not we don't have histories of Indian princes.
Yeah.
Perhaps because it was that ideological approach which totally shut out and saying that, they were the oppressors, they were the this, that, etc., blah, blah, blah. Perhaps they were, but there were a number of progressive
No, even
rulers.
the bad needs to be documented.
Documented.
In fact, Rudyard Kipling had said Providence created the Maharaja to provide mankind a spectacle. And many of them were a spectacle. You had the Maharajas of Kapurthala and Patiala. You had marriages of dogs and cats and all of that, which was celebrated between
Also,
kingdoms.
And then at the same time, you see Sayaji Rai Gaikwad, whose 150th year we are celebrating. Had Sayaji Rai Gaikwad not been there, we wouldn't have had Dr. Ambedkar the way we had. He was the one who sent him to Colombia, then Sri Aurobindo. But there's no documented history of Sayaji Rao. Anyway, that was one aspect. The other, Samuel, I would like you to discuss what you have kept referring to as memories, the role of memories, in history. Before that, for example, there's one, Vikram, you also made a point. Like you said, you discovered it yourself. It stimulated you and you started writing. This is what I refer to, that we have lost these efforts. We have lost these initiatives. For example, there can be many histories, just as there can be many ideas of India. Why should it be just, captured to one idea of India? And the moment you challenge that idea of India, you are a persona non grata. So, for example, there are historians who have written on the Saraswati River, Michel Danino to cite. One needs to discover that. After years, you have a book on the trail of the Saraswati, which is a legitimate quest. So in any case, I would like to, Samuel, I would like you to speak on memories and what is the aspect that you have focused on. That would be very interesting.
Well, a few things. First of all, I totally agree that there are different memories, different histories, different ideas of India. It might not please everybody, but as a matter of fact, it is true, and it's always extremely dangerous to try to homogenize under whatever ideology. Of course, that's a natural tendency of the state, of nation states, and of any nation state to try to homogenize the narrative of history. And of course, the damage is that there's a lot of stories being unwritten. You mentioned the stories of certain dynasties, certain regions. I'm working on maritime history for quite many years now, and though it's now coming back to the front, but still the history of coastal India is really underwritten. And when we are here in Odisha, and of course that's one part of India which contribution has been vastly ignored if we look at the mainstream narrative, though its contribution has been massive, not only to, as a region of India, but as a region of the Indian Ocean as a whole. Now, when it comes to the process of memory, how history is taught, many of my students come to me and smilingly, which is already quite, and tell me, I used to cry before our classes in history or exams. And actually, I don't teach them through the history of names and wars. I try to develop in them a sense of history, the sense of things which are changing, having different point of views. If you look, for instance, at the history of Vasco da Gama reaching in Calicut in 1498, for a long time that was the narrative of that European overseas expansion. Well, first we forget the whole genesis of 1 century of Portuguese expansion over the Atlantic Ocean, the whole narrative of the Genoese against the Venetian over the monopoly of spice trade, and then Vasco da Gama reaches. There is a huge competition happening in the Mediterranean Sea with the Muslims, so he doesn't want to trade with Muslim traders, and Samovar of Calicut tell him, listen, here, I'm just the keeper of communal harmony. I'm no one to decide who has to trade with whom. You trade with whoever is there, and it happens that the spice trade is in the hand of Muslims, so either you deal with them or you go away. I mean, that's not a big deal for us. And during the first meeting, actually, Vasco da Gama comes and try to impress upon the ruler of Calicut, branding himself as the ambassador of the most powerful nation maybe on earth. And he comes, and as a gift, he gives some honey and olive oil, which I guess any tribal leader of the corner nearby the Western Ghat could have maybe given as a yearly tribute, but certainly not someone, an ambassador, who was branding himself as the representative of the most powerful nation. And of course, people think that he's a con man, and there's a lot of misunderstanding happening thereby. It's interesting, a lot of misunderstanding happens, unlike what we think. Vasco da Gama was far from being the first European coming to India. There were a lot of merchants who came from the time of the Roman Empire, and much later on. Actually, when Vasco da Gama reaches the Malabar coast, he did meet some Spanish-speaking North African people who actually were very surprised to see them coming there. But we have a very wrong perception of the word. The word has been extremely, there's always been circulation, flows. Often the quest for history is a quest for origin, which is flawed because things change, things move. The idea of an ancestor who would have lived there millennium and millenniums ago is just impossible. Continents move, everything move or not, nothing repeat, I mean, things are never the same, they never repeat themselves. So it's a history of movement, and the Indian Ocean and South Asia, India, was certainly at the center of, and there's a huge rediscovery nowadays of how the Indian Ocean has been extremely important in the building up of world system. And as a foreigner, as an outsider here who lived in different parts of India and traveled for quite some time, and in Bangladesh too, one is quite surprised about how actually India is cosmopolitan. There's really most of the people are extremely open to, and curious to see different things, new things, foreigners, because it's not new. It didn't start with the colonization. That's the case, for instance, in Bengal. But because it has always been the case, there's always been a lot of travelers leaving from here to, well, you have the Bali Yatri here, for instance, to some other overseas or by land, and a lot of people coming here. It's absolutely not new. So, and there's always been in India that debate of as a shining or India reveal its own genius thanks to, outsiders. It's both ways, definitively. It has always been a world in movement with just circulation, flows, and of course there are some structures which are evolving, which are put in place in order to kind of negotiating, and they're always changing, of course, negotiating this flow of people and flow of ideas, flow of goods, products. So it's very important to kind of keep that memory and not to be imposed a single narrative which serves the purpose of some very short-sighted political interest of the moment, which 10 years from now will look totally outdated. And of course, India, in that sense, for an historian, for me, is like the cave of Ali Baba, because it has really so much to offer in order to understand, of course, the story of the region, but the story of the world itself.
Yeah. Two contradictions come to my mind when we talk, especially, I'm talking of in context of Indian history. One is, we as a nation, I think we need to acknowledge that we don't care too much about our own past, whether it's in terms of documentation, whether it's in terms of preservation of monuments which can crumble. The Mazar of Ghalib was in such bad repair in Delhi. Tipu Sultan, the first person to have rocket missiles in India, his, the places where he manufactured these are in a pitiable condition.
Shivaji's naval history.
Yes. Yet, we get so sensitive when it comes to representation of characters of the past. So today, any objective historian who doesn't belong to all these cabals of right wing and left wing and all these other wings cannot make an objective assessment of any character. We've made holy cows of our characters of the past. If you write something about Shivaji, then the Bhandarkar Institute in Pune was vandalized. If you write something about Tipu Sultan, I've had people even burning my effigy in Bangalore. So, you can't write something about Periyar or Ambedkar. You'll have an entire Dalit upsurge against you. So, communities have appropriated different, and this was the question we even discussed with Mr. Salman Khurshid yesterday, that a country which has no respect for its history, ironically, is so sensitive and touchy about characters of the past, which is one contradiction. The other contradiction is we are a nation of storytellers. We saw yesterday how beautifully, from one episode to the other, a story was woven.
That's a very civilizational trait that we have.
The multiple Ramayanas that we've had, the Mahabharata is an unending story which so many people have contributed in developing over several centuries. Despite that, all these stories of kings and queens and battles and intrigues and conspiracies that should actually make for very interesting storytelling. Yet, our history is not something that is appreciated by young men and women who find it very boring. So, I find these two as extremely contradicting positions. At the same time, as Samuel mentioned, I think there are multiple narratives. We need to constantly ask the question, whose history is it anyway? History has always been, you like it or not, the handmaiden of the powerful. It's the powerful who have the capacity to have his or her history inscribed. It's his story eventually. What are the other multiple narratives? What about the subaltern history? What about the aspect of the women's history? There are multiple narratives that come into play as well. And the third point I'd like to bring in is post-independence, and 53 historians, we actually signed a petition, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists last year, which was, I mean, you like it or not, Indian history and historiography has been dominated and made toxic by this group of left-oriented Marxist historians who have a very unidimensional view of our country's history, particularly of ancient India, and also the government narrative of our independence struggle and post-independence history has been Nehruvian history. So what about alternative histories? Now you're seeing the Netaji files coming out. You have, once you get the entire story of Subhash Chandra Bose out in public, I don't know what all apple carts that will upset. What about someone writing a Veer Savarkar's biography in a completely different perspective through archival research? We have been told a narrative in school, so Gandhi and Nehru and all of them fought for the independence, which is of course true, but then there were several other narratives which were actually also working simultaneously, whose histories we don't actually, there's no space for alternative ideology. So we have this, very strict walls. You mentioned about that, where we are the custodians, we are the intellectuals who know how to, know the tools of historiography and historical research, and we will not allow anyone else into our circle because we know it all. So that entire petition was about that. One is it spoke about a very perverse and reductionist approach, using, viewing all of Indian history and society through only the narrow prism of caste. The other was erasure of traditional system of education and in all fields. Denial of a civilizational continuity. It's almost been that we never existed as a nation. It was just that the British gave us a sense of nationhood. Now, in our, rituals too, the word Bharatavarsha is used several times. So what is that Bharatavarsha? Is it not a civilizational continuity? Also, refusal to accept the darker periods of history. Now, please, let's not build our nationalism on falsehood, or worse, by, whitewashing certain dark periods of history. If there were Mughal invaders, if there were Muslim invaders who demolished temples, who converted people, these were done in the 1100s and 1800s. And as I said yesterday, the albatross of guilt need not be on young Indian Muslim men and women today. So, conversely, to make them feel good, these things need not be erased. State history as it is, acknowledge the mistakes of the past, because that was a different era. You're not going to be able to judge it by standards and yardsticks and definitions you put today of justice, of communalism, secularism, nationalism, which didn't exist in 18th or 17th century India at all. So that was one. The other was neglect of tribal histories, art and heritage. Yeah. And also a very biased and defective use of archaeological, textual and epigraphic sources in the construction of Indian historiography. And lastly, absence of professional ethics, capture of institutions, and a persecution of scholars who held a different point of view. There are numerous scholars who have complained of how those who didn't toe the earlier government's lines were actually, denied, their careers were destroyed. They were not made part of, they were not given research grants, they were not made part of ICHR and other bodies, and their work didn't really come into popular discourse. So I think today, and that's why history is so pliable. It is the handmaiden, as I said, of the ruler. So easily it gets saffronized, it gets desaffronized. I think the need of the hour is to rescue history out of the clutches of politicians and their narrow political gains.
Historicize history, basically.
Yes, and look at various perspectives and agree that history to me is like the famous story of the blind men and the elephant. All the blind men touching different parts of the elephant and saying the elephant looks like this, the elephant looks like that. I think each one is true and each one is false as well. So accept the fact that there are multiple narratives, there is no unidimensional approach to history, and give space for alternative viewpoints.
I think, Vikram, you've put the entire challenges and the way forward and the present situation beautifully as far as Indian historiography is concerned. And in fact, this approach to multiple narrative, this is something which needs to be recognized and which needs to be encouraged. Because the habit of a multiple narrative approach to history got waylaid, marginalized sometime from the 70s onwards. And it's also very interesting, I keep telling myself, because I have been hugely inspired by that generation of historians. For example, R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar, Radha Kumud Mukherjee, and that entire gamut of historians, K. Nilakanta Shastri, the history of the Cholas. You see, what has happened is, over a period of time, we have been told, or for example, K.P. Jaiswal's Hindu Polity, or P.V. Kane's History of the Dharma Shastra, both Kane and Jaiswal were practicing lawyers, but they contributed epochal contributions to the study of ourselves. And in fact, P.V. Kane was given the Bharat Ratna by Nehru's government himself. My point is, over the years, we were told that, R.C. Majumdar's way of looking at history has fallen out. Jadunath Sarkar's study of history is outdated. K. Nilakanta Shastri doesn't work anymore. So, as a result of this, all these generations of historians were gradually phased out of our discourse, and that space was filled in by a particular genre of historians.
You can name them, Dr.
No, all eminent historians, I don't know. And whose main object, well, they were serving a certain ideological line. Fair enough. But the point is, had we continued with these historians also, along with these, for example, I love reading the subaltern group of historians which Ranajit Guha started. It's a fascinating reading. I may not agree with many of the findings, but that's the beauty. But I still enjoy. I read Dipesh, I read Ranajit Guha, I read Ramchandra Guha. But that's their interpretation of history. Similarly, there should have been a dialogue on the other side also. There should have been a recognition and acceptance and a space for those who saw alternatively. Because that space was finally removed, today you have children sitting in Chennai and they have not heard of Uttaramerur inscriptions, which was the first, so to say, constitution of India written by the Cholas. So I think that huge gap, and we lost out on many things. Primarily, we lost out on the capacity to situate ourselves globally. Then we lost out on understanding and examining ourselves as a civilization. And thirdly, we were incapable of really creating and evolving an image of ourselves in tune with the evolution of time. Please.
I don't intend to offend you, but then somewhere, I think, as someone who also represents the think tank of the BJP.
That was a secret, you should tell it.
I think it's there for all to know. But then, we don't have credible right-wing scholarship in this country. Which is extremely, it's a sad part.
No,
I mean,
question
Jadunath
of being
Sarkar
offended.
is the
You're right.
1920s and
You're
30s. Today, if we talk of right-wing scholarship, I don't want nutty right-wing scholarship of the kinds of Dinanath Batra and Sudarshan Rao and others who have headed ICHR. Why can't there be credible, reliable study of Indian civilizational studies?
No, but,
it's also,
yes,
Indology as a study area. We don't even have a chair of Indology in any Indian university.
Till now, we have not had.
Yeah, it's Indology, the study of Indian civilization or comparative study of Indian faiths and religions is studied abroad. So it's a Wendy Doniger who will critique Hinduism for us, and then it's a Dinanath Batra who's the reply we have in reply. So, I mean, where is the equivalence of scholarship there? So I think there is, while we can lament and, you can, this thing that there's been a thraldom, I think that we need Neil Ferguson's right-wing historians, also right-wing intellectuals as the left-wing intellectuals, and also I think a vast space of a centrist ideology as well.
You see, there has been a historical context. You are correct that there is, first of all, that right-wing, left-wing, I don't get into that construct because it's a very outlandish construct, but you are right. You see, there has been a great lacuna on this side because primarily, one, is because of historical context. Institutions have always been closed door, ivory-towered institutions controlled by a certain group or by a certain intellectual coterie. where, as I said, I have called it even this year, earlier in Chennai, I termed it academic apartheid.
Yeah.
Academic apartheid was practiced in this country for the last 40 years. As a result, you did not give level playing field to people, to youngsters from those who didn't hold the same view as yourself. I do not know whether Kartika will publish me. I'm not sure whether that is possible. So, but what I say is that is...
Once she joins her new publishing house.
But anyway, you have a scope. So I'm saying that, jokes apart, but I'm saying that that was in a historical context. So we have to realize that. The other is Dinanath Batra is obviously not mainstream even on this side. So I think we should not take that too seriously. Yes.
Well, I think we should also...
we just have 10 more minutes.
Sure.
And questions.
Sure.
There is, of course, the fact, I mean, there's kind of colonial hangover that there's been a denial of a certain legacy, Indian history during the colonial period, and there was a time when most of the publication went through the censorship of the British. I was mentioning Jules Verne, even a fiction which were including some depiction of the 1815-7 war, which were totally cut out from his narratives when it reached the Indian readership. Nevertheless, we also have to avoid being too, that's my feeling at least, obsessed by the idea of civilization. The subcontinent is proposing a totally different model compared to the European one. I was talking about the trade. The trade, for instance, the maritime trade, which played such an important role in the making not only of South Asia but of the world as we know it nowadays, was not in the hand of the states in India. It was in the hands of networks, much more fluid, much more adaptive, and India has always had that amazing capacity to adapt, to adopt, to change, and of course, to legitimate decolonization, the colonizers have tried to represent India as a very stagnant society, which was totally the kind of slave of very, age-old, outdated traditions, and of course, it was very different from that. And actually, the compulsion to come to the rest of the world, not only India from the European side, was because, well, there was this necessity to acquire wealth and slaves and minerals, and which was much stronger on the part of the European than any other part of the world. Having said so, there's a huge debate about, and there will always be debate about continuity of civilization and so on. I don't think we should project India as that India of, from eternity. It has always changed, it will always change, and that is this fantastic capacity to adapt, to adopt, to also propose, because of course there's been a huge flow of ideas and science from the subcontinent to the rest of the world. I mean, for instance, Buddhist doctors or Buddhist religious men were like in huge demand in China during the Middle Age, just to give an example. It seems that certain also philosophers of different schools were in demand in ancient Greece as well. So, of course, India has also proposed and influenced the world around in a big way. Nevertheless, I mean, history is kind of we are living in the electric era, so let's switch off all the lights and, okay, maybe we'll switch on some oil lamps or whatever, and we will discover also some natural lights which we have forgotten in the modern world, and we'll discover a different world. And I always say that history is to be ready to discover a totally different world, with a different language, different odors, different smells, different visions, and that's this capacity to project oneself out of that extremely heavy, contextualized life we are in by projecting oneself in a different context. And of course, it requires to kind of do away with certain political constraint of the moment. And of course, India in that perspective has an immense array of narratives to propose, because India is quite exceptional in the sense that it has both a very, extremely rich oral culture and an extremely rich written one, because of course it's not true that Indians didn't have any sense of history, as colonizers said for a long time. It's a nonsense. And so let's just try to discover, to pay attention to those sources, to those different voices. And I'll just conclude with that, just to give an idea of how the working of, the writing of history and a single narrative has kind of obliterated a lot of living elements of that country. Like, I lived in Bangladesh, and I was in Bengal for quite some time. And most of us, I think, we've forgotten that the bungalow is the house of Bengal. That's the first global architectural concept, means the house of Bengal. And now if you ask most of the people, they'll say, well, it's an American suburb kind of nuclear family mansion. It's not, and there's a whole history. Of course, the bungalow has changed, has traveled, has been, but it has a very long history, which starts from, well, the northern bay of Bengal. And if you look at, there are immense, immense portions of the history, of the narratives, of history of techniques, technologies, ideas, which are really yet to be really explored. And let's just explore.
Wonderful. I just conclude. I think historically also we have done justice to the subject by making a lot of the audience bored and talkative among themselves. So, and we should open it up. History is a boring subject, particularly after lunch. So, I think I'd probably quote a very famous American historian, John Noble Wilford, who said, all works of history are but interim reports. What people did in the past is not preserved in amber, immutable through the ages. Every generation looks back and, drawing from its own experience, presumes to find patterns that illuminate both the past and the present. So while the bare facts of history do not, of course, change, but the ways in which these facts interlock and change colors to form patterns, I think it's very unique to every historian. So the whole intellectual challenge of historiography is the fact that every work of history, however well it is researched and written or make commercial success, can be amended, can be contested, and also overthrown by somebody who's done a far better job, or when new facts and research material arises. And since we have the controller on stage, I will stop here.
Time for questions. So we have time for 2 questions.
That girl, maybe, and that boy. Maybe let's start with the girl. We have a young.
Yes. Apni bolu, please. No, sir. Let her. Then we'll come to you.
Talking of the young generation, so.
Yes. Let her.
Okay, after.
Yeah.
Please make it short.
Yeah, it's a brief question. So I would like to give myself JP Mahapath. All right? And it's a good afternoon to everybody on the desk and off the desk. My question, history is always written by the victors, the winners, privileged, not by the losers, not by the unprivileged. So, whatever has been done in respect of history, it has been already fabricated a lot. Like the question regarding Buddha, right? It was born. We have got lot of precedents, lot of evidence.
Your question.
He was born in Odisha.
Please ask your question.
No, that's the question I'm giving.
No bhumika. Only question. Please ask, because we have no time.
Okay. Huh? So whether research is required a lot in respect to redefine, reinvent, rediscover the history or not, this is the need of the hour. Please and tell it.
Short answer is yes.
Yes. 3 of us say yes. Yes.
I think we had
A very good afternoon to the panelists here. I am Ankriti Pal and I am having a question. Different historians are interpreting the same incident in a different way. Like, let's take an example of Netaji. Now, some people are telling that he died in the Taiwan means flight accident. And some people are telling that means he was alive as Gumnami Baba in Uttar Pradesh. So, being a common public, we read all these different kind of things. So, how can we relate them? Means it's very confusing, but at the same thing we are getting. But how can we relate all the different thing which we are getting to hear every day? Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You want me to answer?
Yes, I think.
Sir, please.
Well, I don't think it really matters if he died where and when and how, because what we are quite sure is that he didn't bring any significant contribution to the history after that presupposed date of his death. So, of course, you should be kind of a little bit careful between what you read in the newspapers and history. What is in newspapers might not be extremely serious in terms of, history. So you should take it as it is, kind of news. Information is not history. It has a very important role. But history is about really kind of adopting different perspectives and also accepting that we might not know everything, because there is not a single science. I think history is just like astronomy. The more we learn, the more we discover, and the more we understand that we know very little.
It's very essential to make up your own judgment. Read all about Netaji, but then come up with your own judgment and decision. Yes, we'll take one more question. India under Morley and Minto. M.N. Das is again. No, thank you very much. You have remembered M.N. Das today. He is very relevant. Yeah, we'll take a question now. ठीक है sir. आप बैठिए. We'll take a question. Yes, please. Please.
Sir,
अच्छा. One more question. Thank you.
So my question is, don't you think Indian history has done injustice to some of our great men and women? Don't you think it is biased as far as writing Indian history is concerned? And last is, so please highlight the mechanism of interpreting history so that we get right kind of history to read.
Ashok, the second question requires another session. The first one we have adequately discussed. Yes. Vikram, you have some points you can still make.
Sir, in addition to that, I have
don't make supplementaries, please. One question. Okay, the second one's, I'll go to session, pura session. Huh? Not in this one. Huh? Done then? Fine? Yeah? Okay. No, I think, please, I'm extremely sorry. I think we can interact after this.
We can have a personal interaction.
We are putting a pressure on Prabhuji. We should stop now. Thank you so much. I would like to thank
Thank you, Anirban. Thank you.
It has been a learning experience for me. I have extremely enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Vikram. And merci beaucoup, Samuel.
Yes.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you for the enlightenment, gentlemen. May I now request the editorial director, Mr. Chawla, to please present mementos to the chairman as well as the speakers. After such an interesting session, I think those of us who are not much into reading history will now start finding it fascinating. And with such new age historians, I'm sure history as a subject and as a part of literature is going to be far more interesting than what it was decades back. Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen.